Hi, people. It would be the perfect accompaniment. We do have, in our supervision meetings, we have cupcakes. We have cupcakes in our meeting. And we also have word clouds, multicolored word clouds of all the person's strengths that we bring. But we don't have any prints.
We don't have prints.
No. Okay, so let's see. What do we need today? Well, we always need to have our drinks with us so that we stay hydrated. I like to have one warm and one cold. I see that you do too. And today we definitely need paper. I don't have paper. All these Post-it notes are all written on. So I'm going to find some paper. Because our very first activity, you have a notebook and scratch paper both? Okay. Yeah, our first activity does require paper. Okay, I found my notebook. Here we go.
Kate has a cool pad.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Marina has her paper ready.
Okay, good. Great. What else do we need, Franklin? Is there anything that we need to know as we start off here?
I am thinking about it. About halfway through, we'll take a break. So you can be aware of that as it comes. Folks feel like there's something.
Yeah, and where are you signing on from? So then we know where you are, what time zone you're in.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's not a correct sentence. Where are you signing on from? From where are you? From where are you signing on? Thank you, Franklin.
Very proper. From where are you signing in?
Santa Cruz County. Okay. Montara. Portland, Oregon. It's freezing. McKenna, is it so cold? Marina is in Portland, Oregon with you. Ah, it's so cool. Look, they're both wearing bundly warm things. Yeah. And Sarah's here in Oakland with us. Woo-hoo. And Kristen is in Berkeley with me. Mm-hmm. Nice. Okay. Wow. So yeah, there we go. We're doing well. Okay, so so far we are all in the same time zone so far. And that means that it's after lunch. Franklin already named that 3 p.m. is his nap time. And I named that at my lunchtime today, I ate my lunch and then I laid down on the bed and I closed my eyes. And I was like, whoa, I could just go into a deep sleep right now. So yeah, so it is that afternoon time. So let's, we're going to do our best to, I don't know what we'll do. Give us some things to actually work on and chew on. And I guess I'll just remind us, Franklin, to keep getting people to bring their voices into the room. Because I know for myself, when I say something out loud in front of other people, it wakes me right up.
Right.
I'm always a little scared to say something out loud in front of anybody. So we'll have lots of chances for that. And then we will have some time to work in a little time to work in smaller groups. But then I know for myself, like I have the option of standing up at my desk or sitting down. So I just made myself stand up. But if you need to stand up, sit down, move around, turn off your camera so you can like get your juices flowing or anything like that, then please do whatever you need to take care of yourself. So let's jump right in. So we're here today for a training that is called culturally responsive supervision. And this is part of our anti-racist skill building for supervisors series. And what we have found, I've been doing these with Franklin, and what we have found is that there are all different variations of why people show up for a skill building workshop for supervisors. Sometimes folks are in the role of supervisor in name, and it's called that. Other times folks are in the role that maybe was traditionally known as supervision or supervisor, but in some organizations, people are getting away from some of the more traditional naming structures. As you know, I know that in Be the Change, as we build anti-racist versions, as we build anti-racist pivots, we make moves towards becoming more anti-racist. We are sometimes finding that some of the traditional ways of naming things, it's helpful to get away from them because there's so much dominant culture and so much white supremacy sort of stuff baked into some of these names that it's too hard to separate it. Like we definitely learned that with the performance improvement plan recently. You know, for some folks, you say PIP and they're like, you know, and we were like, well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a different thing that's more holistic and that really is integrative and that's restorative. But well, then you can't call it a PIP because it won't land like that. So you might not even be called a supervisor or do what is called supervision meetings. We're still using that term because it's an easy way to talk about it. But it might be that you do manage and coordinate some tasks for folks, or that you are in a relationship of co-held or collaborative accountability and responsibility with folks, or you might be an organizational leader in different ways, designing things, holding vision for things, creating momentum and motivation for folks, or holding the growth and development of maybe your whole org or programs within your organization. All those totally fit into the scope of what we're doing here today. So let's see, when it comes to culturally responsive supervision in an anti-racist setting, there's 3 questions. I'm gonna just put these, actually, I'll put these in the chat. And because I keep saying these out loud to myself because it's the 3 questions that I'm asking myself at all times when it comes to shifting my own skills as a supervisor. And the 3 questions I'm asking myself is, what would I do differently if I applied race clarity? You know, what would I do differently if I applied race clarity? What would I do differently if I wasn't defensive? If I wasn't minimizing feedback, input, and needs of my supervisee? And what would I do differently if I invoked vulnerability? I can tell that the questions are still relevant because even when I read them aloud, when I put the I in there, I can feel a little flutter in my chest of nervousness. So I know the questions are still alive for me. And these are the questions that we're inviting you to join with us and ask these at every turn in this work. Okay, so I'll introduce myself, and I'll introduce myself and start with, when it comes to what would I do differently if I applied race clarity. Well, one of the things is that I would start today's training, and so I will, with a land acknowledgement, that I would acknowledge that I'm signing on today from Berkeley, California, and I'm on Ohlone or Muwekma land, and that it's important for me to remember that everything that I'm doing here is in the context of this long continuum, and that along this continuum, I have stood on many different sides, upsides and downsides of power struggles, and sometimes of oppression and dominance and subjugation and violence even, that either I directly have been on different sides of those struggles, or my people have, or my antecedents in one way or another, the people that came before me. And reminding myself that this is unceded territory. People were here stewarding this land long before my people came to this land. And I'm here benefiting from, the horrible impacts of that violent subjugation. And it's helpful to me because in that case, I apply race clarity and then I say, oh, okay, so then that's humbling for me. It's humbling for me to start there. Thank you for putting that native land finder in the chat, McKenna. Yeah, so if you click on that link and you find out where you are, we'd love to hear where you are. Maybe you're also on Ohlone or Muwekma land, or maybe you're on other lands. Great. Let's see, what else will I say about myself? What's relevant too is that I'm Black identified and I'm mixed race, and I have a lot of light skin privilege because of the way that I look and others perceive me. And then when it comes to supervision, something that I'm learning is, I'm learning that my positional power as a supervisor means that in every instance, it is helpful for me to lead with empathy. So, and what I mean by that is in every instance with the person I'm supervising, to first put myself in their shoes and then think, how are they experiencing what's going on? What is it like from their perspective? Because my positional power means that it's pretty easy for me to get righteously stuck in my own perspective. So I have to actively enforce empathy in every situation. And I will hand it to you, McKenna.
Hey y'all, my name is McKenna. I am your Zoom host for today, so I'm holding the tech here in the Zoom space. We like to just acknowledge that our access to technology isn't equal, it's not equitable, and it really changes over time. And the technology changes too, right? So Zoom keeps adding these new features. It can sometimes be overwhelming. And so if you at any point feel the need to reach out, ask a question about Zoom, you have anything going on your end, please feel free to message me or just unmute and say, hey, this is going on, and I would love to try to support you and just be responsive to what comes up in this space for us today. As I said, my name is McKenna. I use any pronouns, and I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon. I come from a multiracial family. So my mom is white, my dad is an immigrant from the Philippines, and I also hold a lot of white passing or light-skinned privilege, as Aminta was saying as well, because sometimes folks don't know that I am identify as a person of color, and that does bring me privilege. And something I'm learning about supervision is that I have a tendency to feel a sense of urgency when I'm at work. And what this means for my supervision relationships as a supervisee, if I notice my supervisor is feeling a sense of urgency or even just like excitement or wanting to move fast, ready to just get going, they bring that energy, I immediately will start feeling myself like go beyond my body and like try to project what's going to be next. And I lose touch with what I need and what I'm really thinking and feeling because I'm just so enveloped in the work. And so I wrote down some questions that I've been asking myself and asking my supervisor that I'm trying to learn to ask in those moments, which are, is this urgent? What is the level of priority here? Can it wait? And what else is going on? Just some of those kinds of questions to remember who we are in the context we're at. And yeah, that helps me with my sense of urgency. And I'll pass it to Franklin to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, McKenna. And again, Franklin, he, him pronouns. And I identify as Black and a Black father. And I think about, in relation to this concept, I was just thinking about how the things that I did earlier in my career that I thought I needed to do to come off as a competent supervisor and a competent manager, and how I used to wrestle with imposter syndrome. I don't anymore as a supervisor and a manager and an owner. But I just as folks were sharing, Amita and McKenna, just these thoughts flooded as of me as a younger 20-something, where I was trying to learn about how to motivate folks who were in my age group in their late 20s and early 30s, how to motivate my peers as their supervisor to take action and to be responsible for that action. And all the things I did to try to project authority and project competence, as opposed to just practicing authenticity. And so I imagine that I may not be the only one who at some point in their career experienced imposter syndrome as they supervise and manage teams. And I'm really delighted for our conversation today. So shall I share our pathway for the journey?
Yeah, let's go over the
Let's
agenda.
go. All right, so I'm gonna get the screen up. While I'm getting the screen up, why don't we just put some energy into the space? So will you greet the folks on our Zoom call today by unmuting yourself on the count of 3 and saying hello in whatever way is your way of saying hello. Ready? 1, 2, and 3.
Hello,
Hi, everyone.
everybody.
Hi,
Good
y'all.
to see you.
Hey now.
So good. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. So we're here taking this moment to welcome you, to get you set up with your pen and paper for our opening activity. So for those who joined a little bit later, grab a pen and paper for our opening activity. In a moment, we'll do an exercise to unpack trust, one of the fundamental elements in all human relationships, and certainly in an effective supervision relationship. Trust is super important. Then we'll explore anti-racist pivots that will support the growth and development of our staff members. And then we're going to transfer the learning agenda to you so that you can practice anti-racist pivots and think about how you want to carry these frameworks and these practices forward into your teams, your organizations, and for yourself. So that will be our pathway for today. If you can roll with me, give me a thumbs up, or you can use your emojis to give a thumbs up. All right. And with those emojis, I will pass it to you, Amita.
Okay. Oh yeah, I see them. I see all those thumbs now. I couldn't see them before. Thank you. Yeah, as if you have been facilitating or leading meetings or doing things on Zoom, you probably recognize how much these little emoticons are meaning these days. Just, yeah, any reaction, right? Just like something. It's beautiful. So stay off mute as much as you want. I would rather have there be a clatter and a clamor. And I can always ask McKenna to mute folks if it seems like you don't know that your dog is barking wildly and we're listening to it. But I would rather err on the side of more noise and talking over each other than quiet. We don't actually need quiet to get this work done. Okay, so let's do our first activity, which is it's a trust exercise, and it's one that was brought to me by my sister. And the first thing it's going to ask you to do, you can grab 4 pieces of paper or even just 1 piece of paper. And you can if you have 1 piece of paper, you could divide the paper up into columns if you want to, which is what I'm doing, like that. And you're going to start by writing down your own name. So at the head of a column or at the top of a scrap of paper, you're writing your own name. And then following, so either in the next columns or at the top of the next piece of paper, the names of the 3 people you most trust and would be comfortable going to for advice, support, or as a confidant. And for the purposes of this activity, I'm doing it as not people that are in my family. I'm naming the 3 people that are outside of my family, kind of going on the the part where many of the members of our family, as much as we adore and trust them, we didn't necessarily choose them. There's a chosen family version of that. But so I'm writing down the names of the 3 people I most trust that are not in my family. The people that I would be most comfortable going to for advice or support or as a confidant. Right. So I'm doing this along with you. So I'm going to go by my own timing for pacing. But if you need me to slow down, just let me know. Okay, so I've written these names across the top of my columns, or maybe you have each one on a different piece of paper. Okay, next thing you're going to do is for each person, starting with yourself, for each of these, you always start with yourself. I'm going to go to the next slide, Franklin. For each person, you're going to write down the following on their paper. The first thing you're going to write down is gender identity of each of these folks. And for this, it's your best assumption or your best guess, or to the best of your knowledge. How does this person identify themselves in terms of their gender identity? And obviously we don't have to turn this paper in, so you could write a shorthand version or a symbol or whatever would make you remember what you wrote. And now for each person, you're going to jot down the age range, or maybe the exact age for each person. I know how old I am because I got this wrong the other day. And then I checked with my family and they corrected me. I know, it was very strange. I thought I was 51, but it turns out I'm 52. Okay, so age or age range. And for each person next, starting with yourself, you're going to jot down the sexual orientation of each person. So this again is your best assumption or what you have known to be true latest. Okay. And now for each person, starting with yourself, you're going to jot down the highest level of education of each person. To the best, your best assumption or to the best of your knowledge. Oh. Okay. And now for each person, the current parental status of each person. Are they a parent? Are they maybe a step parent or a foster parent or parent of a grown child or small children or many children? I'm just writing for myself, parent or not a parent. And now for each person, you're going to jot down the race of each person. Okay. Okay. we are going to go into some breakout rooms now. Let's see, we will be in groups of, we'll either be in pairs or there'll be one group of 3, randomly assigned. When you get into your room, first check to make sure everyone's there. I see most of you are actually on screen. And hi, Mo. And I don't know if Mo is here. Sometimes when you're there, yay, you're clapping. See, I see you. That totally works. Okay, good. So if you get into a room and your person is off camera, it can be helpful to have that person go first. It just feels nice. If there's lots of reasons we're off camera, and it can feel nice to like get your voice in the room right away if your image is not in the room. And you can introduce yourself and say your name and your pronouns if that feels good to do. It does to me. And then you're gonna ask and answer a question. And so I'm gonna ask you right now to just take a moment to consider this question before we go into that room. If you are being brutally honest with yourself, what did this exercise reveal about trust and identity? But I'm looking at what I wrote down here. I'm just taking a moment to consider what does this reveal to me about who I trust most and how it relates to identity. Okay, so this is what you're going to share with your partner. You can take a picture of the slide if that's helpful to you. And McKenna will also just chat this question to you again in case you lose your memory in the transfer to the breakout rooms. And we'll be in there for just about 5 minutes. So that'll be 5 minutes, McKenna, but will that give 2 minutes to come back?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's give 2 minutes to walk leisurely back since we do have a group of 3 folks.
Okay, so really it's the countdown timer will go off after 5 minutes, but then you'll have an extra 2 minutes. So take that time for sure if you want it. And we'll see you back here in about 7 minutes. Thanks, folks. Enjoy each other.
All right, so let's hear a little bit about what you shared in your breakout. And so we're just gonna have it be open for anyone to share. What came up for you?
Well, I was saying that I found that I seem to surround and trust myself with very similar people. And I was telling Kate that the person who is the most sort of diverse has been my longtime like morning workout buddy, and isn't part of like a group of other interconnected friends. And so that I feel like I trust her probably the most of all, because it sort of it gives you this like anonymity. You can just sort of say or be however you want to be.
That's awesome. Thank you. Someone else, what came up for you? Sue, would you mind sharing?
Sure. I think our group, found the same in general, that the folks were pretty much mostly like us in almost every category, with some variations, but on the whole, just like us.
So what does that tell you?
I mean, it could tell you a lot of things.
What does it tell you?
For me personally, that trust has to do with longevity, and because I was raised in a white family, in a mostly white school, that the folks who've been in my life the longest are white and like me, which, in terms of personal life, means that I am limited and lack awareness and familiarity with other types of peoples, even though I may be open to it and all that intellectually, that I just I don't know what I don't know, and I lack that awareness.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sue. Thank you for that. That was a really honest answer. Thank you.
Let's hear from a few other folks. Marina, would you be willing to share?
Sure. I was in Sue's group, and I talked about I have very little racial diversity in my group. Most and age, range, there's 10 plus years on one side, but the other friends that I trust the most are exactly my age, and that's because I've known them the longest and grew up with them. And just I've been thinking and reflecting about that a lot lately, actually, is that the friends that mean the most to me are the ones that I established in my earliest years of life. And through the pandemic, it's been like, those are the people that I have been leaning on the most, even though we don't even live remotely close. It's just been like, those are the people that we've had this shared experience with. And it just feels like, you don't have to explain a lot, and you can almost like barely use words and just know, or you can pick things up in certain places and it's like no time has lapsed. Two of my closest friends identify as queer. I don't, so there's some diversity there. And then only one is a parent. And I was talking about how even I've leaned on these two other female friends who don't have children because they have more time to just support me and are also super empathetic to my role as a parent. So that's nice.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that.
I was just reflecting on how in my life, the area where I live, the people where I work with, I'm surrounded by lots and lots of people who are from a different background than myself, including my husband. And yet, when I did this exercise, when I think of like, who is it the easiest to talk to, the easiest to interact with, whoever said just who you feel like gets you without, you having to explain a lot, it does tend to be people from a very similar background to me. And I was just thinking about my husband's born and raised in Mexico, and when we were first dating, we used to go to a lot of family parties of people he knew, and I speak Spanish, so I would strike up conversations with people, and you kind of start out with where are you from? How old are your kids? Do you like the food at this party? And you can, it's hard. It's work, to think about where you can find those issues of commonality. It doesn't flow as naturally, and sometimes it's tiring. I mean, it's sort of in a way similar to my experience of learning to speak a second language, where when I was learning Spanish, I could do it, I could get my point across, but at the end of the day, I would just be exhausted. And I think sometimes interacting with people from different backgrounds, it can tire you out in a similar way. And sometimes it's we give up or we step back because it is so much work.
Yeah.
Isai, do you want to share?
Yeah, I can share. I just want to echo what everyone has said. In our group, we had pretty much the same situation where those who we trust pretty much look like us, are almost, in my case, almost the same age. almost same level of education for both. Um, um, yeah, I think I share the same feelings that everyone has shared. For me personally, my couple of or things that I thought about doing this exercise is that I just have two people. I couldn't find a third person that I could say I totally trust. I just had two besides my wife, um,
Mm-hmm.
and both are female. Um, both are educated, and both don't have kids, and I have kids.
Mm,
Um, and both are more or less from in the same background, the same ethnic background as myself. Um, but yeah, those are some of the things that we discuss in our group. I don't know if Paul wants to add anything else.
Yeah, I guess mine was a little different, only in the sense, and I'm trying to figure it out, thinking about it. Being in Utah, which is awful white, putting it bluntly, I do have some diversity. One of the people on my list is Latinx, and she does work with me. And the person who's on this, but my longest friend is multiracial, and we grew up together back in New York. So it's kind of interesting. So I've gone full circle, and I'm the older one on this call. So I've gone from working and living in different places to landing in Utah. So I've almost sought out people of diversity, as limited as it is in Utah, simply because of where my background was prior to moving here.
thank you for sharing
Thank
that.
you, Mo. Sarah, do you want to say anything?
Sure. Everyone else has, I think. Yeah, I mean, same noticings about who my people were, that they're from similar backgrounds as me. I think for me, what it made me realize was just what kind of blind spots that means I have in the world. And also as a supervisor, someone just said this, I forget who, but like it's harder to interact with people who, or it's like harder to find those commonalities with people who don't come from the same background as me. And so it makes me question about, as a supervisor, whether that makes me like a worse supervisor to people who are different than me, because it's harder to like figure out where maybe I don't want to do it as much or something, you know? So that's just one of the noticings from this conversation too.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting to me that question comes up, but I wonder how many, how many folks are, have some version of that question. Like, does this make me a worse supervisor, or does this mean I'm a bad supervisor? How many people are like kind of have that inkling? Am I now a bad supervisor? Right, and so I think the opportunity is for us to get information by coming to this space today. And I just want to invite people to like lean in with that kind of conversation so that we can practice authenticity as strength, and vulnerability as strength this afternoon, so that we can explore inside of what we can create here as a safe and brave space, right? So that we can put those questions out on the table. And then think about and I love your question. I mean, you really, helped to pivot us, because, you all are talking about if my trust circle is very reflective of who I am, right? Then what are the intentional moves that I take to try to be culturally responsive, as the title of the workshop is, And I forget, maybe it was Sue. No. It was Katie or Kate. I'm sorry, not Katie. It was Kate. But to describe, like, this is going to take some work. This is going to take some intentional effort. And I think, for us, that part of the conversation kind of hooks us to our next place, which is to look at, well, how does trust play into this? And how does trust play into supervision? I think somebody referenced that right at the beginning. It was Sue. So you referenced, like, trust is involved with who I'm sharing with and how easy it is to make that share happen and to get advice and to get feedback. But then someone else called out, but then there may be blind spots. So we put all of that into the space this afternoon, and I'll pass it to Amenta.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I love this idea that I already heard, which is this idea that trust takes practice.
Mm-hmm.
That it's and that part of how we know that it's a skill, it's just not some like innate or happenstance thing, is that building trust can be so tiring and exhausting. Finding ourselves in a situation where it's harder to find commonalities can be tiring and exhausting, like any kind of practice is. And recognizing ourselves in that place where we're the kind of only lonely, like, we heard the description of being at a gathering with in-laws and kind of, the exhaustion of like, whoa, just over and over again, being the one that has to search harder to find the commonalities in the conversation. And I can't just lean into a sort of flow that comes when there's so much similarity and familiarity. Recognizing that only lonely experience can be a really valuable doorway into empathy with folks in our organizations and then in our work community, and sometimes our supervisees. Noticing like if this person is one of the onlys of this identity, and there's lots of different identities. Race is one line of identity, and there's lots of different lines of identity. But if they're one of only a few, or if they're the only one, keeping in mind and activating that empathy to realize how exhausting it is for this person, that on top of all the things that they're doing to just be at work, get through life, they're also constantly having to look for these lines of commonality and to build this trust and doing this sort of extra labor of practice. And then empathy with and for ourselves. Yeah. So am I a worse supervisor because I'm different than the folks that I supervise? And, I would say for sure, the answer is absolutely not. No, certainly not automatically. And does it mean it's more likely that I might have blind spots? Does it mean that I might have to work harder, that it sometimes might be more tiring, that I need to seek different intentional forms of motivation to build that trust? Yes, it does mean that, but it doesn't mean that I am automatically a worse supervisor. And then just to touch a little bit on what Mo said too, that for some of us then, and actually other folks mentioned this too. So some of us do this exercise, and we look at the list, and if you expand this exercise out and you do 6 people or 7 or 8 people that you trust most, if you have that many. So we heard that sometimes people are like, whoa, I don't really even have more than 2. But if you do expand it, or if you expand it to include your family and your significant other, then you might see more variety in there, more difference and variety in there. And then to use it as like a strengths finder also. So it can be a way to recognize blind spots for ourselves. Like I might not be as good at building trust when people are of a different age bracket than myself. Because when I look at who's on my list, every single person is within 1.5 years of my exact age. And that could be recognizing blind spots. But it also, when I find lines of difference, I can say, oh, look here, this person is different than myself in this particular line of identity. Now, how is it that I've built so much trust with them? that must be a place where I've done something. I'm strong. I have realized something, that I can say, okay, so clearly I do know how to build lines of trust when someone is, of a different sexual orientation than myself, for example. A fun way of also interpreting the results of this, and I've done this activity in lots of situations, in like huge auditoriums full of people and in small groups and in a supervision context. And I've done it also with a new supervisee as an activity to get to open up a conversation early in the relationship about trust. And in doing it over and over again, one of the ways to play it back for myself is to ask the question, so if these people were applying for a job as my confidant, according to what I see revealed here, what are the qualities that someone would need to apply for this job? And when I did that today, it became laughable. Like, it was just like, well, it's the range of who could apply for the job as my confidant is so narrow. It's like this teeny little segment of the population. And indeed, they have to be very, very much like myself. And significantly for me, they have to be very much like one another. They're actually all they're different than me, but they're very like each other. It's like I'm just looking for the same person over and over again, apparently. So it can reveal a lot. It does connect so directly in so many different other ways to supervision too, in that, in this realm of practice, that if we know that we have more experience and practice building trust along lines of identity where there's a lot of similarity, then we know that we have to slow down and maybe put some more intentionality into building trust in the supervision relationship. Now, that's true for us as supervisors. If you take that and you flip it around and you put yourself in your supervisee's shoes, because I have positional power over the people that I supervise, and I say, oh, and now for them, it's even more true. It's exponentially truer for them, even, that they're going to have to do so much work, because not only are our lines of identity have difference between us, but I also have positional power over them. So they're coming in with all kinds of fears built in. They're afraid of being judged. They're afraid of being evaluated and found wanting. They're afraid of getting bad marks or bad grades, or being, really what they're afraid of is they're being afraid of being kicked out of the circle of trust, which is another way of describing what happens when you're censored or fired from a job, is that you were in the circle of trust of that organization or that workplace community, and now you're outside of it. And it's most at the center of many people's worst fear, is being kicked out of that circle of belonging and trust. So thinking, okay, so then it connects absolutely to everything that happens with this person. So I wanted to, for a moment, look at this, a little bit of some of the neurobiological foundations of that, because a lot of what I'm talking about here is very much in the realm of sort of sociology and understanding people and how people work together. But there are a lot of things that we can find in the studies, in neurophysiological studies, and some of the stuff is really recent and exciting research, and it's some of the work that people are doing with mirror neurons. And mirror neurons, there's the work is happening so fast, it's developing so fast that we can barely actually keep up with it. So there's a lot more to be known, for sure. But generally speaking, one way of understanding how mirror neurons work and how it connects to trust is that our brains are looking for mirroring, and we feel calmer when we get it. So recently, we have come to understand, relatively recently, we have come to understand that this actually explains a lot of things about humans and human behavior that happens from a very, very early age. So it is why when someone smiles at us, we often instantly smile back. And why the way that you basically teach a baby to smile is by smiling at the baby, and that the baby will then pretty quickly catch on, oh, you smile at me, I smile back at you. And when we look at our brains, yes, the brain absolutely learns on the yes. And mirroring, or seeing ourselves reflected back, is experienced by the brain as a yes. We like to match what we see. And how does this translate? And there's a lot of different ways of sort of looking at that, how that then plays out and what you can do with that information. In mirroring technique is actually one of the techniques that's sort of recommended in some sort of professional development type settings as a way to put people at ease. And a lot of people find it actually manipulative that people would use that as a way to put each other at ease, but it actually can be a way to soothe somebody, to mirror back their stance, their expression, their body language, their hand gestures. When someone is feeling really activated and upset and freaked out or intimidated and scared, it actually can be a way to send them a message of soothing, even with your body and your facial expressions. So it is true that mirror neurons exist. We can see the physiological evidence for it in fMRIs and in examining the brain and in watching and measuring the stress responses of human beings in relationship with one another. It does mean that we may be predisposed to feel less comfortable when we're working with people that are different than us, because the mirror neurons in our brains are scanning for similarity and then they're finding difference. We can stop sharing the screen for a moment, Franklin. So, why this really matters in work on becoming anti-racist, sort of another added layer, has to do with stress and our body's responses in stress and what happens to our brain in stress. If we know that the most primitive parts of our brain, ones that are there from the earliest age and before we're even born, are the ones that are responsible for scanning the environment to make sure that we are safe and stay safe. And as we scan the environment, looking for safety, so this is the part of the brain that's responsible for fight, flight, freeze response, right? As I scan looking for safety, if I find anything that is alerting or alarming, then that fight, flight, freeze response can be activated. When that fight, flight, freeze response is activated, I am less likely to be able to access my decision-making, executive functioning part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So my best thinking is not necessarily available to me when I'm activated or triggered or stressed in that way. So if one of the ways that I reduce stress, like in a workplace environment, is I look for similarities and I scan and I'm not finding that. If I'm in a situation, so with a supervisee, the person is feeling under pressure or like fear of failure or some other form of fear, and they're looking for being soothed and they're seeing you and I'm not finding the similarities here. This person is different than me. I can't be soothed there. So they're staying in that activated or triggered state. When we're in that activated or triggered state, one of the dangers there is that this is a place where bias can slip in to our thinking. And the way that can happen is this. We need a way to explain that we're okay to ourselves, explain differences that we're seeing, and we'll cling to anything that we find. So if I'm uncomfortable or stressed out and I'm looking for an explanation or something to soothe myself, then generalizations, I become much more susceptible to believing generalizations, including stereotypes and myths about people. So it becomes much easier to believe, well, the ones that have been directed against me, for example, are women are overly emotional, or people of color, generally speaking, tend to this. They're always late. People of color are always late turning in their timesheets, late to the meeting. Or Black women are too aggressive. Black women have an anger problem. They're really scary when they're angry. Those kinds of stereotypes and generalizations about people, they're in and among us. They're floating. They're in the waters that we swim in. They're in the media. They're there. And they're much more likely to slip in. I'm much more likely to create and believe blanket generalizations when I'm looking for a quick story to keep myself safe, when I'm looking for a quick way to explain a feeling or a moment of discomfort that I'm having. And so it's one of the places where we can, if we're not watching for it, there can be a blind spot where we start to get into this confirmation bias loop, where we have a myth or a generalization or a stereotype that's lingering out there somewhere. We feel uncomfortable, and we take that myth and apply it to this feeling of discomfort, the situation that's causing the discomfort, and then move forward, not really knowing that we're now dragging along some BS belief along with us in how we're reading the situation as it's happening. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask, how does that land for people? Does that resonate? Are you like, no? Or are you like, huh, maybe, yeah, or yes? How does that land for people?
Well, as a person with a background in developmental psychology, it lands very well. I mean, I mean, from birth, infants do this. They mirror the adults in their lives, and they're already accustomed to listening and speaking language that they've heard in the womb, right? So it makes a lot of sense, what you're saying.
Yeah.
Wired that way.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Anyone else? Maybe a different response or any questions?
The thing that came to my mind, and I'm going to be authentic and vulnerable, is
Love it.
bias about Gen Z employees. And also potentially that there is a reality that the generation has a different take on work and showing up at work, and the kind of the interplay between the bias and the reality.
Thank you for that.
Which is confusing to me personally.
It's very confusing, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, generalizations, all of them, including the ones that are stereotypes or myths, the reason that they don't work ultimately and are dangerous is because they're monolithic. They try to force anyone or any group of people or whatever it is, the category is that you're making the generalization about, into a one track. And there are always so many exceptions that it's actually not useful, right? And if we're too determined to believe the generalization, it's actually dangerous. It can blunt our ability to see what's really happening. We won't look at the exceptions because we're trying so hard to make everybody fit the rule. And yet they wouldn't stick and stay so much if no one fit into it, right? So you're right, it's confusing. I mean, I know it's confusing for myself. So I'll use that same example. As a Black woman, there's a stereotype around Black women and anger and aggressiveness, and that has been levied, the accusation of that, or the description, that generalization. I have experienced it all throughout my life. And I actually have a problem with anger management. Darn, that sucks for me because it would be so much better and easier if I could say, I never raise my voice. I don't make scary faces. I'm never defensive. I'm not aggressive. I'm never on the attack. I don't ever stampede over other people's thoughts and opinions. I don't ever act out in anger, but that's just not true. I do all those things. And so even in my individual case, that's pretty confusing. So then what do you do? Because there's a collusion there between the stereotype generalization, which I don't want people to use it as a way to misread me, missee me, to label me, shunt me to the side, blame me for things that I did not do. And all those things have happened. But on the other hand, there's a reality, that I actually have to be able to receive feedback from folks on like the impact of your behavior when you were angry, is that I got hurt, and I was hurt by your aggressive behavior when you were angry. Yeah, really confusing. And certainly with the generational thing, it's very confusing. We're all really grappling with that one right now. Yeah, Sarah.
Just I wanted to respond to that one because when I think about that one, I also think about like Gen Z, like their relationship to work. I don't know exactly what you meant when you said that, but what comes to my mind is like they don't want to work as much or whatever. That's the generalization. And then I think, oh, well, like our society is messed up and the way that we work is messed up. And so maybe actually they have a point there and we should be doing things differently. And so like maybe I should actually like listen to that and be like, okay, let's like maybe try something different about the way we work in this place. And so that's also confusing to me, is like, how much do I go with that like pushback, which is also pushing back against like the, you know, white supremacy that we swim in and all of the ways that our systems and organizations are built that might not actually best serve us. So like, when do we like go with that and be like, oh, actually maybe that is like helpful for us to be thinking. And when is it like, no, you have to come to work on time?
Yeah. I mean, and really, so, and you're pointing to, as you know, the sort of, well, there's a white supremacy characteristic which we've been working with, which is the either or thinking, and another one which is one right way, you know, and both of which, the antidote for me is to remember in every instance, if there is a way to understand this and talk about this as a both and situation, I'm going to use that way. If there is a both and here, I'm going to find it that both of these are true, and this is what we think or believe, or this is what we want, this is what we need, this is what we are going to do, given that both are true. It's one of the things that you know, that we've identified in terms of doing anti-racism work, is that we have to get practice at being comfortable with our own discomfort and with ambiguity. I don't want ambiguity. I would love for it to just be like clear-cut lines, and it so often isn't. But the more that I can recognize discomfort and ambiguity are going to be the norm, certainly in any conversation about race and racism and equity, but also, you know, generally speaking, actually, discomfort and ambiguity will be the norm. So what do we do as supervisors? What do we do with all this information? And to some extent, what we're proposing starts from some simple kind of human relations basis. You know, it's not like specialized anti-racism thinking, but it starts from thinking about, what does it take to build relational trust? If what we need to do is to practice building that relational trust, and knowing that trust, the speed of trust is sort of the slowest moving of all the building trades, you know, but that building relational trust between the supervisor and the supervisee, that's key. And that's especially true when there are several areas of difference. So the more lines of difference there are between myself and my supervisees, the more true that it will be important to build that trust. And that we're suggesting that we do this through, you know, deepening relationships, through team building, you know, and meaning, generally speaking, the more that we spend time and intentionally invest in building a sense of team, the more there's going to be room for relational trust. And by that, I mean expanding it out beyond just the supervisor-supervisee relationship, that because in fact, what I want for my supervisee is that they're building relational trust. They have trusting relationships with many folks in our workplace, not just with me as their supervisor. Because the more that they have places where they trust at work, actually, the less weight there is on this one trust dependent relationship. And the more practice they get also, because, right, both sides have to be practicing building trust along lines of difference and similarity. And then getting to know each other through check-ins, meaning that, there's the one-on-one that happens. And so checking in at the beginning of the one-on-one, first of all, making sure that I don't jump right into any kind of a task-related agenda, but incorporating check-ins into any time I'm meeting with this person. And then also, sometimes we're in a work situation where there isn't a rich time. You don't have an hour set aside every week for a one-on-one. It's great when you do, and sometimes we can't. But that we can also activate informal, faster, quicker, smaller in-between check-ins also. And to think of it as like, yeah, this is a task that I'm going to get done. I'm gonna put this on the list and then check it off. Did we take time to put connection before content in every interaction I have with my supervisee? And then reflecting on the differences and similarities together, so they're explicit in the relationship rather than taking you by surprise. This is where, like, doing that trust exercise with the supervisee can be really rich. That it allows us to surface, where are we different, where are we similar, and who do we each already have practice building trust with, so that we can talk about what the differences and similarities are. There are always similarities, and listening for similarities is a challenge that we can pose to ourselves as supervisors. In every instance with my supervisee, I'm going to be listening for similarities. Sometimes it's easy for us to spot the differences, and it can take a little bit more practice to listen for the similarities. Okay, and with that, I'm going to ask you, Franklin, do you think we should take a break?
I think this would be a good time. We're right at the halfway point.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And so come back at, in Pacific time, that's at 25 after 3, but 25 after the hour. Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, see you in 10 minutes.
Awesome. So welcome back from the session, hopefully, or from the break. Hopefully you maybe got to stretch a little bit. You peeked at your email and then looked out your window and saw a little bit of what the weather is doing. Or you just confirmed that it's still cold in Portland, still cold, still freezing. And then for this next little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And over the course of our series, we've been looking at how we might consciously and unconsciously use these practices or access ways of being, and then bring them into our supervision or into our management structures. In particular, we're going to call on 4 of the characteristics to inform our thinking about culturally responsive techniques. And so as we present, you can both think about how it shows up structurally in the workplace, but also think about, how does this show up in my own supervision practice, right, as well. And with that, we'll start with individualism. And we see this person on the island, and like that person, we might try to go it alone. And so in this one, it's believed that people work best individually rather than collectively. Value is placed on self-sufficiency, efficacy, and economizing of time and resources and completing the work. So in this one, we might see some examples where we delegate a task and we expect staff to complete that task on their own without help from others. Or we might hold some judgment if they seek out help from others. We might mentally assess with our staff, or mentally assess on our own who came up with an idea in a meeting and assess that rather than thinking about how the idea was generative and involved many people. You know, we might see in our staff teams that people hold a standard that they should be able to problem solve on their own. And we also see a lot in our society, this desire to pedestal a leader or an innovator or a powerhouse without recognizing the teams that exist alongside that central figure.
Sense of urgency. And this is differentiated from, you know, just simply moving at a faster pace or a different pace. And we like that icon of the emergency light because it's the emergency services siren that's kind of putting the brain and the body on high alert, like, wah, 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 move faster, move faster. And this is where we say it's more important to keep things moving and taking on more work than to slow down, step back to deprioritize or take care of oneself or others. And in doing this, the important can be sacrificed for the urgent. The way it shows up in my supervision is where I think, well, there just isn't enough time to incorporate everybody's input early on in the design process or in the thinking or in the visioning of this thing. So let me work on the ideas and develop them and flesh them out before I pause and ask, what do you all think? Which happens over and over and over again. And it is true that it does take more time, but because I already know that that is true, then I can build timelines for making decisions or designing new programs or structures or creating new materials or whatever it is I'm doing. I can build timelines that take that into account and say, actually, why don't I plan in advance to avoid having to show up with that sense of urgency and make decisions about what input I take and when based on a sense of urgency. Why don't I plan for that? I'll avoid it by planning for a timeline that is more spacious. Yeah. And for a little while, I was doing that by doubling any, if I said that will take 2 hours of labor or 4 weeks of work, I would double it. And now I've decided that in some cases, I actually just have to quadruple it. I'm going to say, you know what? No, I'm so off in terms of how much time it will take. It might take 4 times longer than I think it's going to take. And in cases where I can, to plan for that extra time.
Paternalism. And in this, in this graphic, we see the suited leader drawing a barrier around their colleagues. It's a whole feel right there. And in this definition, those with power feel authorized to think and act on behalf of those without power. So we might see some examples where staff are told what to do rather than being invited to the problem-solving process. And there's definitely a connection, I think, with power hoarding and just this idea of deciding how much information to release, when to release it, and not, hold the perspective of what it, how that impacts the staff member or how the staff person is perceiving that power hoarding or that paternalism as well.
And then finally, quantity over quality. Things that are measured are prioritized, examined, and discussed. And people's emotional needs or attention to process are secondary to concrete outcomes. And this can look like deprioritizing anything that I deem as emotional or kind of touchy-feely. So skipping the check-in, sacrificing the connection, because I think it's more important to attend to the content. And I can always rationalize and explain away why the content is the bottom line and we need to attend to that. But if I consistently deprioritize people's emotional needs, and don't pay attention to how the process itself is impacting folks, I can start to build up and increase separation between myself and the folks who are pivotal and central to the actual labor that is required to get things done. And this one, I can say actually for all of these that one thing that is very true is that for all of these white supremacy characteristics or dominant culture traits, that they're all existing within the structures of capitalism, which is the structures that all of our organizations exist within. Even when we are in an organization where we're doing our best to dismantle some of the impacts of that, like where we maybe have more collectivism or even a cooperative or co-op kind of structure, or we flatten some of our hierarchies, because some of our organizations were doing that work, that we're still within the greater structures and the foundations of capitalism, which means that if we just address our behaviors, for example, as supervisors, and we don't simultaneously address the bigger practices, the salary structures, the like hiring process, for example, outreach, and then for some of us, those of us that work in nonprofits, the way that funding structures work and how we have to interact with funders. If we don't address some of those bigger practices, it won't be enough. We can start with ourselves and our supervision relationships and our supervision mindset, our supervision skills, but ultimately we actually do have to address the greater systems and structures. So why it is that we're looking at these white supremacy characteristics and looking at ourselves and our skills to trust and to build skills as supervisors is because it is a part of the process. So I keep returning to this definition of anti-racism being the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So in here, there are attitudes, but it does point directly to the fact that we have to, that it's, all of it is in the direction of redistributing power within the supervision relationship and within the organization itself. And it's the combination of moves that we make, the moves that are small and large together, that make up what we call the anti-racist pivots. The countermeasures that move us away from letting those dominant culture practices remain the status quo.
Perfect.
Yes, there is a whole nother training there, Sue, on funding requirements and the obsession with quantity over quality. That is a whole other training. You're right. Love that. Great.
So this idea of making pivots as countermeasures, let's look at an example. So we could, in our example, we could begin by centering the collective versus the individual, right? And in that example, right, countering the individualism, even countering the paternalism and some of the power hoarding, then we start by assuming no one person can or should do it all. And then we think collectively about what resources are needed to complete the project and what functional roles and skills we can combine to make a strong team. And we work towards developing high-performing cross-functional micro teams. And so to get to those high-performing teams, here's some coaching questions that we can offer amongst others to put folks together, right? So we can look at our staff members individually and say, what gifts does each person bring? We can also ask ourselves, where does each person struggle? And then who can I then pair together so that they can support each other's growth areas? And we'll share this with you at the end of the training as well, just as a reminder. So as we look, so that's just one way into going into anti-racist pivots. And then we could continue to look at other anti-racist pivots. So we'll have let's look at some transformative practice moves. And as we share the next few slides, I invite you to pay attention to what resonates for you. And we're going to ask you in just a second to use some of this information to start to think about how you want to apply these concepts in your work and with your staff. So let's look at this. And we're going to start with returning back to the white supremacy characteristics, and then see how we can make some pivots from there. So to undo paternalism and power hoarding, we will build systems, structures, and templates. And that includes articulating competencies for our staff and giving courageous feedback so people know where they stand. That means we're doing the work to clarify roles and responsibilities. We make our project budgets transparent. And we ask ourselves and other leaders, if we want more shared ownership and decision-making, how do we visualize the thinking that lies in the manager's head?
And to undo individualism and fear of open conflict, we can create process agreements for interaction across difference. So we can create process agreements on your team, and I would say in every iteration of a team. So I consider my supervision relationship. I consider a project team that comes together even for a short-term project we're working on, and then also sort of larger long-term teams that Be the Change. That's the leadership team. We meet regularly, and there's a group of managers that meet regularly, but then there's like a marketing comms team that meets regularly. I meet with my supervisee regularly, and create process agreements that work on each of those teams, and create them collectively and collaboratively. That we can, in that process agreement creating process, we can name values and agreements. So there might be organizational values, but I want to say, and what are the values that are present in this team? I can use a conflict or tension naming process. And by that, I mean, get a conflict resolution or a restorative conflict process ready before you need it. Don't wait until there's a tension to hire an outside trainer to come in. And then this happens to me quite a bit. I'm hired and asked to come in because there's been a conflict, or there's a conflict that's been unresolved. There's a tension existing in the organization, and folks are calling me and they're saying, we want you to come mediate this tension. And I come in, and one of the first questions I ask is, so what is your conflict resolution or your tension naming process that you're working with? And very often people say, we don't have one. So then as a trainer, I'm like, okay, so now I'm going to try to teach you a process and then apply it to the current conflict or tension, which of course, as we heard earlier, someone put in the chat, we learn on yes. And when people are already in conflict and tension, there's hard no's happening inside of people. And so that's not the right time to teach a process for conflict resolution. We teach the process for conflict resolution when there isn't one present. And then finally, using an aligned project management system to make tasks and deliverables transparent. And that might seem obvious. I know it'd Be the Change. I don't know for why, but it took us a long time to figure out, our working context has changed. So we're not going to get back to whiteboards and Post-its and sticky notes anytime soon. We have got to pick ones that work in a virtual setting, for hybrid work settings and remote work settings that work well also, things that we can all look at the same time together.
To undo a sense of urgency, we articulate key outcomes for each team, provide time for grappling, mistake making, reflection, and celebration. So we want to be clear, first and foremost, about how much leadership these groups have. One of my friends says, no false democracy. And then give cross-functional teams initial support, right? So making sure folks have the resources they need to get launched and to get going, right? And then set recurring meetings and identify a process and protocol for the recurring meetings. And then as the manager, stay connected to the process. So don't dip out on one end, right? Then the pendulum swings to the other end, don't micromanage. So then let's work this muscle. So we're going to try on an activity that's going to begin with a personal reflection of someone you supervise. And we're going to offer a structured thinking tool to reflect on the role of dominant culture and impacting how you see this person. And then start to think about some anti-racist pivots that you can take on to support that person. So I see that McKenna has dropped a link to a handout. And let's see, we can maybe even show, hopefully you're able to open the link. So if I click on the link, then it's going to make you, we're going to get a forced copy. So we all get our own individual copies. And then you'll get the handout. Oh, great. Thank you, Marina, for that. I appreciate that. That feedback is incredible for us. And then you'll go through step 1 and step 2. And step 1 is going to be a little bit of assessment. What's the current reality? Step 2 is going to invite you to start to design anti-racist pivots. And there are other steps, but we imagine that for the next 15 minutes or so, you'll be able to get through step 1 and 2. And then you can do the rest on your own. So let me just also just check and make sure, is there anyone who wasn't able to open it? I know sometimes the firewall with Google can be, all right, great. So it looks like we're all set to go. So again, we're going to do this on our own. And so, yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a thought, and then we'll check in with you in a bit. All right. So we're going to go into breakouts so that you can share a little bit about your situation, your analysis, and then so you all can hear some of the designed pivots that came forward.
What came up for you as you were working the handouts or in your conversation just now with your partners?
I can go. Our team spent a lot of time, or our group spent a lot of time talking about, I mean, the piece that seemed to resonate a lot for our group, or we had a lot of energy around, was needing a process around the conflict tension naming process, and how it's so necessary and also so frightening at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so necessary. What is, can you name one of the things that's frightening about it?
Well, I mean, I can just talk about, you know, I came from the perspective of, or what you had said earlier was super resonating with me, because we are an organization in transition who's coming off of really high conflict, and what you had said about like trying to get that in the place when there is conflict, it's too late, like way too late. And so I think that now that things feel a little bit calmer, we're in a new transitional phase, I think it's just scary after coming off of like so much conflict and so much tension. It's like, I can't take anymore. Like I cannot handle any more tension and any more conflict, even though I know it's important.
Yes.
That we get ahead of it. And especially with new leadership, we understand their process around handling conflict and tension and set a new culture. But it's still scary just because like when I think Kate, if it's okay if I say that you'd said like when things are going well, it's like, do I really want to like open up the Pandora's box and like welcome conflict and tension because like it feels good right now and I want to stay in this like happy space. I mean, I'm just using my own like animated thing because I'm like definitely like I want to bury my head in the sand and pretend like conflict doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how much more were you inviting the race conversation into the space, right? So there's inherently making all uncomfortable, and folks are hoping that we don't step on landmines, but we can't be anti-racist by being neutral. We have to actually wade into the mud, if you will.
Yeah. And thank you for Sue put in the chat. Are there resources for conflict or tension resolution processes that you can recommend? Well, okay, so I'll answer that question partly by saying, like we've used a bunch of different things. So I went to a training with Compass Point. They're a local organization here in Oakland that was called Conflict Resolution with Power and Privilege in Mind or something like that. But it would be worth looking at their website just to read the description of that training, and because it's not unique really to them. There are other folks that do that kind of training, but it was very useful. And then what I can say that what we use most often, this kind of points in some cases to what you were just saying, Marina, is that actually what has proven to be very useful to us is some of the work that comes from nonviolent communication, that whole universe. It actually is kind of like a universe, and specifically the process of being able to identify feelings and identify needs, and to be able to name feelings and recognize my needs, and to practice listening to other people naming their feelings and recognizing their needs. Also, the practice of being able to guess or intuit at other folks' underlying needs. And so why that relates to what you were just saying, Marina, is that we found that we need our conflict resolution processes or conflict or tension naming processes themselves. They have to be healing and soothing in their nature, because even if we're not in the process of the current conflict, we're all carrying tension and stress and trauma from our past conflicts. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be a built into whatever it is, a way in which it can't just be a like problem solving tool. It actually has to be a healing system. And so, so restorative practices in general is, again, that's sort of like a whole universe. But looking at like some of the restorative practices scripts that they give, ways of being able to identify, how to use, I statements within that. And then and there are exercises to practice that, to name the impact of what you said or did, and then to ask for what I need, and then to reach agreements, or to reframe and offer back what I heard. All these different practices all come out of nonviolent communication, restorative justice, or restorative practices. And all of those in that Compass Point training I went to, they touched a little bit on each of those, actually, I can say. Right. What else came up for folks?
Did we hear from both rooms? What did the other room discuss? I don't know.
The other room had Sarah in it.
I
Is it
mean,
it doesn't need to be confidential? Is that what it is?
no.
Oh, okay.
Well, I don't think so. We we mostly just talked about the people that we supervise and like the things that we were each thinking about and struggling with, I think. I guess I can share for myself, just like each of these, I think these organizational practices like definitely do come into my own management, and I have to like all three of them in this worksheet like definitely show up in my management of this supervisee that I was thinking about. And the one that I realized was sort of the most intense was around the beliefs around individualism. And she has much more of a tendency to like bring everyone to the table before moving forward with things. And I'm like constantly frustrated by how slow that is, and like how much longer it takes, and how I'm like not even sure if those other people are like in line with the goals that we're trying to accomplish. And so just some of these sort of ideas around how to talk about that felt really helpful for me.
Thank you, Sarah. That's so rich. I love it. So I'm wondering if it came up for anyone, like, I don't know, if you came out of any of this, if you're coming out of any of this thinking, well, yeah, I do want to make some of these pivots or make some of these changes. What do you think it will take for you to do that? What does it take to do some of this?
Well, one thing it made me think about is we were already kind of planning to do a staff retreat in the new year, hopefully in person. Hopefully that will be a time we can do that. But I think that some of this kind of thing, we really need to step out of our daily environment and not in a 1-hour staff meeting or, so yeah, I think that would be a really good time for that. I also think bringing in some kind of a facilitator, especially to have an honest conversation about looking at our differences and looking at, intersectionality of privilege. I don't feel like I'm the person to be leading that conversation with my team. So I'm gonna talk to folks I know and see if they can recommend a good facilitator for that conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Great. So time, and that's, all this represents investment, like the time, the more wide open vista, and then maybe an outside person. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Love that. That's beautiful. And recognizing that sometimes we have to pull ourselves out, that who it's coming from will matter, will impact how well it goes, how people feel free and safe to share. Yeah. That's beautiful. What else? Anyone else recognize what it will take for you to make some of these changes, maybe? Isai, what did you think of?
I'm thinking that, what it's going to take is to be intentional and to invest a lot of time, because I feel like a lot of these approaches we can already talk about within our agency, but we just don't have time sometimes to do it.
Yeah.
Or to sit down and have our one-on-ones with our coworkers or supervisees and really, really be intentional about, for example, the retreat um, and get to know our coworkers. That aspect that doesn't have anything to do with
Yeah.
our jobs,
Yes.
and it's not easy because of the structure that we have and because of the lack of time that we have, and I feel like it's not our priority in a way, you know.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's gonna take you know, be intentional
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for that. Great. Yep. Well, so one of the things, we're coming to the end of our time here together. One of the things that can happen here is that we start to identify and be able to better describe. So how am I perpetuating some of this white supremacy characteristics? And one of the things that can lead us to do is to start to answer that question, like, am I a worse supervisor? Am I not the right one for this? And what I wanted to point to here, and this will be in the slide deck, and you can look at these in more detail later, is that one of the things it might take is for us to reconstruct how we evaluate and assess ourselves as supervisors. That the competencies of an anti-racist supervisor have some things in common with the sort of general skills and competencies needed for just to be a great supervisor. And there are some things that are a little different and that get much more specific and clear, you know, that, and I want to maybe suggest to you that you consider pivoting and maybe looking over these and deciding, I'm going to add one of these to my goals as a supervisor right now, something I'm working towards, you know, that I am demonstrating a competency as an anti-racist supervisor when I can show that I have the ability to grow, mentor, and invest in staff that are different than myself. That might be a strength that I already have, or one that I'm going to work on so that I can claim it for my own. Or that I build a staff development plan that balances a racial context analysis and builds on staff gifts. So one of the competencies that I've been working on is being able to recognize staff gifts. You know, what are the strengths in each of the individual staff members that I work with? And how do I build a staff development plan that leans into those strengths? And one that has a racial context analysis for understanding and describing some of the areas for growth, the deficits or challenge areas in individual staff members. So I'm just going to encourage you to look these over when you get the slides sent to you, to look these over and maybe choose one to pick out and focus on. You know, that these allow us that instead of defaulting to centering dominant culture practices, like, for example, to say, well, how well did I stick to the performance review timeline? And I was feeling terrible because we are so behind in our performance reviews because we've redesigned our performance review system. And so we're totally off the timeline that we wanted to be on for this year. But instead, you know, how well does my performance review process, how well does it balance a racial justice context, a racial context analysis, and build on staff gifts? And actually, if I'm using that as my measure, I'm doing really well. So getting away from that sense of urgency and getting into some other way of assessing myself.
So we want to offer some next steps for you. So the first, of course, is to complete the rest of the activity in the reflection handout. Know that that is a copy, so you can make copies of copies and do some assessment and analysis around your supervision of other staff members. And that'll help you to design some more anti-racist pivots and some of your own. And then, of course, as Amenta just said, you get to integrate those competencies and discover others as well.
Great.
And then, McKenna, are there some details about the evals?
Yes. Yeah, so I just placed a link in the chat and we'll send it to you in a follow-up email as well. Just inviting you to give us some feedback on today's training, and what you do say will help us better all of our trainings in this Borrow series. So we really welcome any and all feedback that you have. It just really helps us grow and learn how these land for you. So thanks so much.
Thank you for that. Okay, folks, thank you so much for all your engagement and the investment of this time and your attention. And I love your emojis and your emoticons. Come off mute so we can hear your voices as we're leaving the room. And thank you. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Look at that.
I
Thank you,
like to play
everyone.
with those.